Hi, this is Andrew from Unitarian Apologetics. Welcome again to a very special presentation. Today we're going to be talking about the popular claim made by Trinitarian apologists that there's somehow a Jewish Trinity. Or they'll say the ambiguous phrase that there is somehow complexity within the Godhead. And so we're going to be looking at this idea, and we're going to be playing a clip from a prominent Trinitarian apologist who makes the claim that somehow this Jewish Trinity is supported by various books by Jewish scholars such as Alan Segal's Two Powers in Heaven and Benjamin Sommer's Bodies of God, etc. You maybe have scrolled on YouTube and saw videos such as The Mystery of the Jewish Trinity, or even this by Michael Heiser, which appears to be a master's level class on the Jewish Trinity. Okay, here's another one, A Jewish Defense of the Trinity. Now, before we proceed, I want to play this clip. It's of Jay Dyer, and he's making this, what is just a common claim by Trinitarian apologists that somehow that the Jews believed in a Trinity, and that these books that they'll refer to support this idea. Let's watch.
The problem with the idea that the Trinity is in the Old Testament is that there are literally zero Jews who were Trinitarians. So if
Not true. Not true.
Okay.
I've got 5 Jewish texts right here arguing that the Old Testament had a multiplicity of persons in Yahweh.
You can say there's a, so
No, I've got them right here. I've got them literally on the screen.
Yeah, I see the screen. I see the screen.
All right, so here the gentleman tells Dyer that there are no Jews who are Trinitarians. And Dyer responds, "That's not true. I have these books here which tell you otherwise." Right? He refers to them somehow as Jewish text. Maybe he misspoke there. Obviously, they're not written in Hebrew. There are books written by Jewish authors. I think that would hardly make them Jewish texts, but perhaps that's just a semantical argument. And so here's the claim made by Trinitarians. They'll say that the Jews believed in multiplicity within the Godhead, whatever that means. And so I would argue that when these authors, I think it's just one of the authors, makes this claim, and we'll see what they actually have in mind is more that there was a belief held by some Jews, and we'll see this from one of the authors. It's just some Jews. Some Jews believed that there was a second divine figure who operates within the realm of God in heaven. But this figure in these texts, these authors say repeatedly, is someone who is subordinate to God. He's someone who operates under God, but somehow within his realm. Which is really just begs the question, well, what characteristics or qualities does this second person have? Well, notice that it's never argued that Yahweh is more than one person. They always argue that God is one person. The argument from them is that there is a second divine figure who somehow operates within the realm of God. And so I believe that these authors may, if they use this, and they do, mean it in a different way than what Trinitarians do. And the claims made by Trinitarians are vastly different than what we see from these Jewish authors. And here's another problem, is this is from anyone, but especially here, when they say the Jews believe in XYZ. The problem is obviously that different Jews believe different things. And we're actually going to see here in a second from Alan Segal himself, where he says that it was actually a growing sectarian group who the Orthodox or mainstream Jews were actually having to refute their heresies, or at least attempting to refute their heresies. Okay, and I also want to give an example from history about this. Again, so different. So the claim is, so they'll see that some Jews believed some things, right? And then, but what do? They make this irresponsible blanket statement that all Jews believe something, or they'll say the Jews believed in two powers, or the Jews believed in complexity within the Godhead. I want to give a historical example, the type of irresponsible reasoning and research that's done by the Trinitarians. Let's give a historical example, okay? Around the 8th century BC, there were several inscriptions that were found from certain Jews, and the inscriptions read, Yahweh and his Asherah. Okay, now Asherah was, of course, a pagan goddess of fertility and things like this, and there was this belief by some Jews that Yahweh had a wife. Okay, so here we found two inscriptions where it says Yahweh and his Asherah, and then on the bottom of the screen we see these Judean pillar figurines. Again, fertility goddesses, probably Asherah. Now imagine if we irresponsibly said that the Jews believed that God had a wife. Now, how irresponsible would that be? And that's exactly what's going on, because certain Jews would speculate that the Memra, or the Logos, or wisdom, or Metatron, or Yahuel, or the Son of Man in Daniel 7, or Melchizedek, or an exalted human like Moses or someone, was somehow a second power alongside God. Does this make them correct because some Jews believed it? And wouldn't it be irresponsible to say the Jews in general, with a broad sweeping statement, believed that this was true? The Jews believed in Metatron. The Jews believed in an exalted Enoch. It's just irresponsible. Okay, and again, so Dyer makes the claim, perhaps he just misspoke, but what he says is that he gives the impression that the Jews believed in complexity within the Godhead, and we're not really exactly sure what he means by that, because Trinitarians often fail to define exactly what they mean. It's kind of an ambiguous phrase, especially till we define exactly what is meant. Alan Segal says in page 147, he's going to say here's the author they love to go to, and even this author says that there's a growing body of sectarian biblical exegesis. Okay, he says, the earliest differences of opinion for which we have evidence were centered on Scripture. The rabbis attempted to defeat a growing body of sectarian biblical exegesis supporting a binitarian heresy by suggesting an unorthodox understanding of the crucial Scripture. Okay, so the rabbis are attempting to defeat them, and I have to admit, the rabbis didn't always do such a great job either. But nonetheless, this doesn't say that most or all of the Jews believed in this. It's saying that there was a growing body, this is admitted by Segal, a growing body of sectarian biblical exegesis supporting a binitarian heresy. Again, when you see this, two powers, what's really meant by that is two gods. And there was a greater God and a lesser God. Okay, there was one God who was Yahweh, who was the Father alone. He was God. It was never brought into question and should never be, right? But there was this belief that there was this second divine figure who operated within his realm. Okay, and in the last book we're going to look at, which Dyer notes here or refers to, it's literally called Two Gods in Heaven. The book is literally called Two Gods in Heaven. So when you see two powers, you should understand it as two gods, as two powerful beings in heaven. Okay, and so the books that he lists off Benjamin Somner's Bodies of God, Alan Siegel's Two Powers in Heaven, Daniel Boyarin's Borderlines, and Two Gods in Heaven by Peter Schaefer. They had another book with him, but I couldn't quite identify what it was, and he didn't list it off. But this is not even exhaustive of all the books which highlight ideas like this. There's many more. Some that are even better than these. None that argue that anything like a Trinity, where there's one divine nature in three persons or something like that. Okay, so before moving forward, I do want to touch on this idea. You might hear it a lot. I'm not claiming to be an expert on this idea, but it gives us a general idea about these two different types of thought within theology. A lot of people you hear claim divine simplicity. The general idea in divine simplicity is that God has no physical or metaphysical parts. His essence is identical to his attributes. God is indivisible, meaning he is not made up of separate things or components that work together. Okay, so that's mainly what we want to take from divine simplicity. He's not made up of separate components that work together, supposedly. Now, in divine multiplicity or divine composition, it teaches that God consists of different aspects, manifestations, or hypostasis. God is a composition of different parts, is the general idea. So we have in divine simplicity, God is not made up of different parts. In divine multiplicity, somehow God is made up of different parts. For instance, God's name might be a separate thing from God's glory, might be a separate thing from God's wisdom, but somehow these form a compositional God, if you will. Okay, and this idea or thought process became popular in Merkava mysticism, where God may consist of numerous different parts. Okay, and so this is important because we want to look at what these authors are saying and understand what they actually teach versus what Trinitarians will say that these books mean. So we're going to look at them. We're going to look at direct quotes made from these authors, which make it very clear their position. Okay, the first idea I want to point out, though, from Benjamin Sommer's book and what he has incorrect in his theology, and which should make us question his credibility in the first place, is he believes that God is embodied. He believes that God has a body. And he speaks on Genesis 1:26. He says that these verses, the let us make man in our image, he says, these verses assert that human beings have the same form as God and other heavenly beings. That the shape in question appears not only in God's body, but also in the bodies of other heavenly beings is clear from the first person plurals of 1:26, in which God speaks to the members of the divine court, let us make the human in our form and shape. And so a couple of things. First of all, he's teaching that this is not a Trinity, which is speaking in Genesis 1:26. But that's sort of a side point from what we're talking about here. Nonetheless, he's saying that God is embodied, and what it means to be made in the image of God is that you look like God. Somehow you resemble God, and the angels look like men, and everybody looks like men, which is just a completely false idea. And this is reiterated in his translation, or his interpretive translation here, let us make the human in our form and shape. It's not really what the text says, not what the text means. But perhaps that's a secondary point. Here's the main point of his position and how he understands these things and what he argues for in his book. He argues that God could fragment himself into small-scale manifestations or mini-bodies that were parts of God. That's not what the Trinity teaches. Perhaps you could have modern Trinitarians, analytic Trinitarians who teach a social Trinity, where they could say something like there's parts of God and not really have a problem with it. The problem with that is, again, they're at odds with Latin Trinitarianism, which teaches that somehow God is one self. Okay, they teach God is one self, but he has three persons, but somehow the persons are not parts. And so it's just conceptually vague. But let's move on. Let's understand the main thing that he's teaching here, and we'll see it again from Sommer, we'll quote directly from the book, is that he believes that God is one self who fragments himself into small-scale manifestations, and that each of these small-scale manifestations were then a part of God. So God is one self who could fragment himself into multiple parts, which were somehow selves. Okay? He says on page 24 and 38, he says, the divine body, like the divine self, can be fragmented, yet somehow remain unified. Any one body was part of the God, but did not exhaust the God's fullness, just as a God's self was not confined to one person. This view can be found in the Bible itself. Okay, so this is his claim that he makes. When you look at what he uses, the evidence he uses to substantiate his claim, it's very poor, to say the least. But nonetheless, the main thing that he's teaching here, okay, he's putting forth a claim. He's telling you what he thinks God does. But he's saying that God is one self who fragments himself into different parts. And each one of these parts did not exhaust the God's fullness. And in other words, each piece was just but a part of the God. Okay, let's go on. Okay, he says something very strange here too about the angel of Yahweh, the Malach of Yahweh. He says, in many passages, the word Malach, literally messenger, but usually translated angel, means a small-scale manifestation of God's own presence. And the distinction between the messenger and God is murky. Okay, this Malach is something very similar to an avatar in Indian religions. And one wonders whether avatar might not be a better translation of the term when used this way rather than angel. The Malach in these cases is not a being separate from Yahweh whom Yahweh sent on a mission. Rather, it is a part of the deity that can act on its own. And so listen to what he's saying here. Again, there's one self, and he's saying that a part of the one self somehow became manifest. And he's saying that the angel was not even sent. And so he's contradicting not just what the word Malach means, as one who's sent by God, but also he says that we should actually translate this as avatar. Okay, and uses Indian religions as his model. Okay, but also again here he says that these are small-scale manifestations. It's not a person distinct from God. Okay, this is not what the Trinity teaches. The Trinity does not teach. This is more consistent with modalism. Okay, where you can have essentially one self who can manifest in different ways, essentially. But for Benjamin Sommer, he's saying that one God can fragment himself. So the angel is just a fragmentation of the one self somehow. And he questions whether angel or messenger is even the correct way to understand the word malach. Okay, so, but again, this is nothing like Trinitarianism. Okay, and then here, so there's a viral clip of Sommer going around where he talks about this idea of the Trinity and that Jews shouldn't have a problem with the Trinity. The problem with this is that Sommer doesn't even seem to understand what the Trinity even is. Okay, and we see this explicitly, page 132, he says, for all the trouble that Jewish and Muslim philosophers have had with this notion, the Trinity emerges as a fairly typical example of the fragmentation of a single deity into seemingly distinct manifestations that do not quite undermine the deity's coherence. And so he doesn't even understand the Trinity because this is not what the Trinity teaches. The Trinity does not teach that there is one self who fragments himself into many different parts. Okay, that's just partialism. Okay, that's not what the Trinity teaches. And so at least he puts forth a model that would probably be more consistent with the Bible, though, in that God is clearly one self. Nonetheless, this is not the doctrine of the Trinity because there has to be two selves and they can't be a part of God. And so people go to this and don't understand that Benjamin Sommer has an incorrect perception of what the doctrine of the Trinity even is. And so they hear this, they have a confirmation bias. When they hear the Trinity, they get excited, okay, but they ignore the rest and the real substance about what Sommer is saying. Okay, the next book we're going to look at is Alan Segal's Two Powers in Heaven. Okay, he talks about a lot of different things in this book. He talks about Daniel 7 is a prominent verse that comes up. We're going to actually discuss Daniel 7 and this idea here because it comes up so much. But he also talks about ideas about a second power being, for instance, Metatron or Yahuel, angels, all right? And even exalted human beings. He might talk about the Logos of Philo, which I have a lot of videos on my Gospel of John series, which talk about Philo and his Logos. The Logos for Philo is not a separate person, but they'll also talk about things like the Memra, and wisdom, and they would speculate that somehow there was this second divine figure who operated within the realm of God somehow. Okay, and so we don't want to misunderstand what Segal is saying here. Okay, but I do want to talk about this idea about the one like the Son of Man in Daniel 7, which is a major verse used, one of many verses, but a major verse used by these certain Jewish people when they were speculating about there being a second divine person next to God or operating within the realm of God. Okay, so let's read this verse, and then I want to get a little background context and then show what the Bible means when it speaks about these things, and evidence from the Bible where we see these themes repeated throughout it. Okay, and so Daniel 7 verse 9, and Daniel's having this apocalyptic vision. This is apocalyptic future vision. He's seeing something that's happened. And I also want to note that there's nothing in this text which inherently should tell us or teaches that the Son of Man is necessarily a divine person. This is something that I would argue has to be read into the text. Okay, and we'll look at a few things and why people believe that. But nonetheless, I don't believe there's anything that tells us that this person is a second divine person necessarily. Okay, Daniel 7:9, Daniel says, "As I continued to watch, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat." This Ancient of Days is obviously just one person. He's Yahweh. He's called the Ancient of Days because he is the one who is eternal. Okay, he's represented as having white hair and a beard, white beard, representing his wisdom. Okay, and then we go on in verses 13 and 14. "In my vision in the night, I continued to watch, and I saw one like the Son of Man, one who looked like a human being, coming with the clouds of heaven." Okay, and a lot of people get caught up on that phrase, "coming with the clouds of heaven," and I want to look at this phrase and see if we can't understand a little better about what's going on here. Goes on to say, "And he approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence," the Ancient of Days' presence, "and he was given dominion, glory, and kingship, that all the people of every nation and language should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed." Okay, so a lot of scholars will point out, but a lot of people might not be aware of the background context or the cultural context of this particular idea, especially this idea about the rider of the clouds. Okay, and so we see in the Ugaritic Canaanite background, okay, that it's a polytheistic religion, and we see that there is a supreme God. His name is El, and he's given the title the Father of Years. Now, this is obviously very similar to the Ancient of Days, and they both have the same meaning. Okay, but in the Ugaritic literature, there's a second God, and he's a lesser God. So there's two gods here, a greater God and a lesser God. And Baal is said to be the rider of the clouds because he is a rain god, and is a rain god in that he brings fertility. Okay, and we're going to see this here. Okay, and in the Baal cycle myth from Canaanite literature, Baal defeats the sea god Yam, and the word Yam in Hebrew and Aramaic means the sea. Okay, and essentially what's going on here is a battle between two different forces or types of water. Okay, you have Baal, who's the rider of the clouds because he's the god of rain. That's why he's called the rider of the clouds. He's the god of rain and fertility because rain brings life to things. But Yam, it represents the sea. He may be a personification of the sea, but he's presented in these myths as being a separate god. And so Yam represents the sea because it's chaotic and destructive. Okay, and so you have these two different types of water. You have one from Baal, who's the god of rain and fertility, and the Yam, who's the sea essentially, and it's wild and chaotic and destructive. And Baal actually defeats Yam, and El is hesitant, but he gives him this kingdom and things like this. And so this is not to say that Hebrew literature stole this myth or that it's exactly the same. In fact, I think it shows What is the consistent pattern? That the Hebrew Bible will adopt these certain traditions and myths, and they will adapt them to glorify Yahweh and present things as they truly are. Okay, and so we see this idea about the sea and how it's chaotic, and we're going to see that in the Bible, the sea becomes symbolic for the forces or nations that are oppressive to God's people. These are chaotic forces which are outside of Israel, essentially, you could say. And we see this in Daniel 7. So we back up a few verses and we see this. It says, "In my vision, in the night I looked, and the four winds of heaven were churning up the great sea. Then four beasts, great beasts, came out of the sea." Now, obviously, this is symbolism of what we see here. The Bible does not have people fighting literal monsters in the sea. Okay, so the Hebrew people seem to take these ideas and again adopt them and adapt them to glorify the God of Israel. Okay, and we see this continued in Revelation. We see the same idea about the sea and it being defeated. Okay, and we see in Revelation 13:1, "Then I saw a beast with 10 great horns and 7 heads rising out of the sea." Again, here it's not a literal beast rising out of the sea. All of this is symbolism, and we're going to see how the Bible actually portrays this idea about God ruling through his king over the seas, his human king, explicitly. Let's read. In Revelation 21, it's interesting because it says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and earth had passed away, and the sea was no more." So the symbolism here is that in the new creation, in the new heaven and new earth, there will be no oppressive forces outside. It says the sea was no more. And so we have to understand the symbolism of how the Bible uses these various stories to glorify the God of Israel. And we see this, we're going to see here that yes, it is God who ultimately rules the sea, but we're going to see a explicit Psalm 89, where he does so through his human Messiah, who he identifies as David, which would obviously be a descendant of David, which would obviously be the Messiah. Okay, he says about God, "You rule the raging sea. When its waves mount up, you still them." And so here God's responding, and he says, "I have found my servant David. With my sacred oil I have anointed him. My hand will sustain him. I will set his hand over the sea and his right hand upon the rivers. He will call to me, 'You are my Father, my God, the rock of my salvation.' I will indeed appoint him," God speaking, "I will indeed appoint him as my firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth." And so again here, this descendant of David is being appointed God's firstborn, who is the highest of the kings on the earth. And yes, it is God who rules the sea, but how does he do it? He says explicitly, "My servant David, my hand will sustain him. I will set his hand over the sea and his right hand upon the rivers." And so God is not ruling through a second God, not through a separate divine person, but rather a human person. Okay, so the Bible often takes these myths and uses them to glorify the God of Israel and show how God works through human beings. And that's the dynamic of what we see here. All right, so the next book we're going to look at is Borderlines by Daniel Boyarin. Let's pay attention to what he says here. It's not the Trinity, but we'll see what he says here. He says, "Thus, one of the most characteristic differences between Judaism and Christianity as we know it is the belief in or denial of complexity within the Godhead. But in these early centuries, there were non-Christian Jews who believed in God's word, wisdom, or even Son as a second God, while there were believers in Jesus who insisted that the three persons of the Trinity were only names for different manifestations of the one person." And so he's saying that there were believers in Jesus who believed that the Trinity, so-called, was just different manifestations of one person. So essentially modalism, right? But notice when he talks about complexity within the Godhead, what he means by that. Okay, what he means is that there were certain non-Christian Jews who believed that God's word or wisdom or even Son was a second God. This is not the Trinity. Okay, if the who's the first God is obviously just the Father alone. And so all of them believe that the Father was the true God, but only some would believe things like that God's word or wisdom was a second person. Now, this is interesting because a lot of modern Trinitarian apologists will deny the idea that God's wisdom is a separate person, but the early developers of the so-called doctrine of the Trinity believed that wisdom was an actual person alongside God, and they believed that he was Christ. And some of these Jews also believed that, and it's explicitly stated right here by Boyarin. Okay, so when they say complexity within the Godhead, what they mean is that there's a second divine person who operates somehow in the realm of God. Okay, but God is obviously just the Father alone. But they would believe that there was a second divine person, and people would speculate about that. Okay. Page 92, Boyarin says Logos theology and thence Trinitarianism emerges as a difference between Judaism and Christianity only through the activities of heresiologists on both sides of the divide. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, there were Jewish non-Christians who firmly held theological doctrines of a second God, variously called Logos, Memra, Sophia, Metatron, or Yahuwah. Indeed, perhaps most of the Jews did so at that time. So let's focus on what he's saying here. What he's saying here is that in the 1st and 2nd centuries, there were Jewish non-Christians who had a theological doctrine of a second God. So they weren't Trinitarians. They didn't believe in the complexity within the Godhead in the way that Trinitarians mean it. What they mean is what he's saying right here, and what they're all saying is that they believed in a second God. Now the question is, who did they believe was the second God? What is they were speculating on? What tells us right here? Variously called the Logos, Memra, Sophia, Metatron, or Yahuwah. And so I think it's first important to distinguish these categories here, because you have Logos, Memra, Sophia. That should really be one category. Now none of those, I would argue, and am willing to argue with anyone and demonstrate and prove it, that the Logos, Memra, and Sophia are not separate persons. And ask yourself this, go read Proverbs 8 and really ask yourself, is Lady Wisdom there in Proverbs 8 a second person distinct from God, or is it just a personification? You have to really ask yourself. Now the second category would be beings like Metatron or Yahuwah. These are just angels. You would even have like Enoch or Melchizedek. You have Metatron, Yahuwah. Okay, now this is not what the Trinity teaches either. The Trinitarians don't teach that Jesus was Metatron or Yahuwah. Sometimes they teach that he's the Logos, the Memra. Predominantly, they'll teach that he's the Logos or Memra. But when you actually go back to these sources like Philo, that's not what Philo's teaching. The Memra and the Targums don't actually teach, and no almost unanimous consensus of scholars today would say that the Memra is not even a second person, and Sophia, Lady Wisdom, in Proverbs 8 surely is not a second person. And so all of these speculations are just incorrect. But nonetheless, it's showing that they would speculate on them. Okay, but none of these are the doctrine of the Trinity by a long shot. The Father is God, indisputably, but they would speculate that there was somehow a divine person. But the question is, ultimately, what does the Bible teach? The Logos, the Memra, and Sophia doesn't teach that these things are distinct persons from God. And it surely doesn't teach anything about Metatron or Yahuwah. Okay, it goes on to say, there were also significant and powerful Christian voices who claimed that any distinction of persons within the Godhead constituted ditheism, and that's correct. Again, if there's one God, and they believe in divine simplicity, if they say that there's three persons, but somehow there's not actual distinctions or parts of God, then it's just incoherent and it's ambiguous, and they claim it's a mystery and you can't understand it. But the reality is it's just logically incoherent. And at least it's conceptually vague, so we can't even deny or affirm it because they won't even really define exactly what they mean. And they withdraw into this whole thing about it being a mystery. And that's not even really what's going on here either. Okay, but then they're saying that there were powerful and significant Christian voices who claimed that any distinction of persons within the Godhead constituted ditheism, because that's absolutely correct. It's one thing to say that one person manifests himself in different ways. It's quite another to say that multiple persons equal God somehow. Okay, an important thing to note here, just to discuss, he says on page 90, one of the clearest symbols of what most Christian and Jewish scholars have taken to be the early and total separation of Christianity from Judaism has been the centrality of Logos theology in Christianity from an early date. A Logos theology that has been thought to have little to do with authentic or proper Palestinian Judaism. And so one thing that he argues here is somehow that actually the Memra somehow equals the Logos, and says that, and he argues this in an article that he has on something like the Gospel of the Memra. He talks about how the Memra is essentially what John had in mind, but I think this is incorrect. And so he talks about Logos theology was thought to have little to do with authentic or proper Palestinian Judaism. In a way, that's absolutely correct. Okay, because you would have more Palestinian Judaism, which would be things like wisdom literature and the Targums predominantly, but the Logos, which also had, which I would say argued were familiar with the Memra and the Targums, and also wisdom literature, but also the idea of the Logos developed in Alexandria, not necessarily in Palestine. And so you have this separation of Alexandrian theology, which is the Logos, which we see in Philo, who was a Hellenistic Jewish philosopher, is a little bit different than that what we see in Palestinian Judaism. Nonetheless, I would argue, and do argue, that the author of the Gospel of John was familiar with all of these schools of thought. He was familiar with Philo, but also the Memra, and also the wisdom literature of the Old Testament and the Intertestament periods. And here, Boyarin, he's quoting in agreement with Eldon Epp. Eldon Epp says that the clear answer is that the model for the prologue was provided by the wisdom hymns of the Old Testament and Apocrypha. That is, the Johannine hymn to the Logos was inspired in content and in form, generally at least, by the hymns about or by personified wisdom. Okay, so a lot of Trinitarians today don't even understand the origins of their own doctrine, what all the speculation was even about and where it comes from, and what these authors are actually saying is the inspiration for the Johannine hymn. So in the beginning was the Logos and things. They're showing clear parallels to wisdom literature and even Proverbs 8 in the Old Testament, which is also wisdom literature, but we'll also see intertestament wisdom literature, I guess we could say. But the Trinitarians don't even understand the origins of their own doctrine, and it all ultimately comes back to, well, is personified wisdom actually a person distinct from God? And it's not. And so anybody who speculates about that, no matter how many there are just incorrect. Nonetheless, Trinitarians don't even understand the origins of their argument, and it all boils down to, is wisdom a person or not? So ask them, is wisdom a person or not? A lot of them today understand that wisdom is not a person distinct from God, which gets really interesting, right? Because they don't even understand the origins of their own doctrine. And Boyarin goes on to say, page 115, the divinized or hypostasized Logos is collaboratively invented in antiquity by writers who are, with a few minor exceptions, readers of Genesis 1 and Proverbs 8. From the Gospel of John to the Gospel of Truth, from the Tripartite Tractate to Clement's Alexandria Trilogy of the Word, from Justin to Philo to Origen, Logos emerges in the dialogical play of scriptural interpretation. And so this is saying that all of these earlier thinkers in the first and second centuries were having these conversations and speculations about the Logos with the background of Genesis 1 and Proverbs 8. But our modern Trinitarians don't even understand these origins of their own stuff and can't even get into the minds of these earlier thinkers and what these early Christian thinkers would speculate on. But in fact, they're reading with Genesis 1 in the beginning and Proverbs 8 in mind. And a lot of them would identify Jesus as wisdom in Proverbs 8. But modern Trinitarians don't. And so if Proverbs 8 says, it's wisdom giving her autobiography, and she says, I was with God when he created. But then they agree that wisdom is not a person. So who was the God that wisdom was with? It's just the Father alone. And so you prove Unitarianism. All right, and so the next book, I didn't really feel I needed to spend a lot of time speaking about because it's right there in the title, the contradiction. It says two gods in heaven, and we're going to read what he says in his conclusions and show that it's just completely at odds with Trinitarianism. And so, indeed, these authors don't teach what these apologists say they do. Okay. When we look at his table of contents, we see again here, not a multiplicity within the Godhead, as in there's one divine nature and three divine persons, or even two divine persons. What they'll say is they'll see, again, the Son of Man in the vision of Daniel. They'll speculate about that. They'll speculate about personified wisdom, it says here, even divinized human beings, Enoch, and again, the Logos, according to Philo, which is not a separate person. Philo believed that the Father alone was the only true God. And he did not believe that the Logos was a separate person, okay? And again, it's right here in the title. When they say two powers, what they mean is two gods. And so perhaps the Trinitarians are correct in that they're polytheist, and so were some Jews. But of course, they will not concede to that. But again here, let's focus on what these writers are actually saying and not what these Trinitarian apologists claim they do. Peter Schaefer says here on page 134, the Jewish heaven was by no means always content with one God. But despite all trends to the contrary and manifold attempts to keep these trends at bay, was often populated with two gods or a number of divine powers. Okay, and so let's pay attention to what they're saying here. This is not Trinitarianism. They said that these certain people were not always content with one God. Okay, that's not Trinitarianism. The Trinitarians argue for one God. They make the incoherent claim that there's one God in three persons, but yet it's divine simplicity, but the persons aren't parts, or they'll claim divine complexity, but then they'll argue that it's not a fragmentation of one person, it's somehow different persons, but then the persons are not different parts, right? And so the models themselves are incoherent, but nonetheless, these authors all, as I just demonstrated, actually try to teach that some Jews, not all Jews, believed in two gods. Here it says right here that the Jewish heaven, this author claims, was by no means always content with one God. And that's completely at odds with Trinitarianism. So to summarize, Sommer teaches that one God, or that one self, fragmented into different parts, multiple small-scale parts, so that each small-scale person was only a part of God. That's not the doctrine of the Trinity. Boyarin and Segal teach that the rest teach that some Jews believed in two gods. Okay, and Schaefer argues that often Jews believed in two or more gods. Okay, so none of these teach the doctrine of Trinity at all. Actually, what they teach is that either one God fragmented himself, and they misclassify this as Trinity, and it's not, because the Trinity can't teach that, or they believed in polytheism. That's what these authors actually teach. It's nothing like the Trinity. And so I think that I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, but I will say that they're either just ignorant of what these books actually say, and they're reading it to select little verses out of the book in order, with a confirmation bias, to try to prove their position, hoping that no one ever reads the books, or they're just grossly mischaracterizing these books. And either way, I think they're grossly mischaracterizing what these books teaches. But now we've looked at these, and this is probably only the beginning of dissecting this false idea that there was something like a Jewish Trinity, and especially the idea that these books teach something like that. Of course, all of this is solved when we understand that God is just one person. He is Yahweh, He's the Father alone. He created through wisdom, created through the Logos. He sends His Spirit, and that God works through human agents, as we see with the Messiah Jesus, that Jesus is a man certified by God. Okay? And so all of this is solved when we understand that God is just one person. This one person can manifest himself in different ways, and he sends out angels or messengers who he commissions or empowers to act and represent him on his behalf. That's why they're called malach. That's why they're called messenger, because God, who is one person here, is sending out a message. We've looked at Daniel 7, and we see the background, the Ugaritic background for this whole idea. And we see in the Hebrew Bible how God operates and rules the sea through his human Davidic Messiah. All right. And so, again, I think that this video addresses the basic claim that these books that they always refer to somehow teach a Jewish Trinity. And perhaps we can finish this dialogue and go a little deeper at a later time.